So we'll go back into our bark surface, and I'm going to select our mixed material, or actually our ecosystem, and add a new layer. And now what I can do is just go and select, we have a snow material under landscapes, which is our first material. If we could use that as a starting point. Right now we can see that we have an alpha boost, a setting which is causing a blend between our surfaces, and really we want it to overwrite the underlying surface, and then we can adjust transparency amounts afterwards. So I'm going to set our alpha boost to 0, and this way we just have the snow, and I'm going to move this layer down so it's below our ecosystem material, and what we have is a tree that's entirely covered in snow right now. So we can go ahead and render this out, and this way we can get a better idea of how our snow is going to look before we start constraining it and restricting it to specific areas of our tree. We can tell that the bump map that we have on our snow is really a little bit too large to simulate the kind of snow we would see on these branches of these trees. So after this is done rendering, we can go ahead and modify that until we get the snow to look correct, maybe increase the bump map, and then we can start constraining it to specific areas of our trees. We'll go ahead and close that out. With our snow layer selected, we'll go to Bump, edit our function, and you can see we just have a gradient map with a combiner that is kind of just reducing the overall effect of this noise node. I'm going to decrease our scale. We could also use, for a little better effect, we could use a fractal node, but right now I'm going to stick with the noise node because it'll render a little bit quicker, but I am going to increase the depth and make that look a little bit better. We'll go ahead and render this out. Now we can see a nice bumpy surface, and that's good for our overall bump on our snow, but we might want to have very tiny bumps to give little flecks of light with the specular values to make it look even more realistic. So we can add another material into that. Go ahead and just hit escape to cancel this out. We're going to go back into that snow layer, edit our function, and now I'm going to add in another noise node. Since we had the gradient selected before, it's going to create the same exact gradient, and I'm going to scale this down so it's very small. Add this to our combiner node, and then decrease the amplitude of input 2. Maybe increase the offset, and we just want to make sure that it's not really overriding. And the reason we see it really is because we have the add mode. So we're going to change our combination mode to blend, change our offset, increase the amplitude of our first surface, so we start to get some of that bump back, and then we just want to have that little bit of grain showing up on our surface. Maybe decrease our depth now because we have that effect. Go to our Effects tab, and I'm going to increase our ambient up to 60 so we have that nice glow that we'll get from snow. Highlights, make it a little bit brighter and a little bit shinier. Go back into that bump map, and for that gradient that we have, the noise node, with all the little flecks, go ahead and decrease the amplitude a little bit more, so we just have it showing up in smaller areas. Let's go ahead and render this out and take a look. And now we can see a much more realistic looking snow, although our bump looks like it might be a little too high, so we can decrease that amount. I'll hit escape, go to our snow layer, decrease the bump amount to about 0.15, render this out again, and we just want to remove those really dark shadow areas that we had. And that looks pretty good from what I can see so far. So now what we can do is start restricting the snow to specific areas of the plant, and also an angle, because of course it's a big storm that we have, a snowstorm. There's going to be more snow on one side of the tree than there will be just on the overall amount, depending on how the snow is falling. If it's just falling straight down over time, then you're just going to see it basically on the tops. But if it's in a storm where there's a lot of wind, then you're going to see it more populated on one side of the tree. So now to begin restricting the snow to sort of just our branches or an orientation of the tree, we're going to open up our material, select that snow, the layer that we have, and under the Environment tab, what we can do is use the slope range, like we did with the icicles, just to kind of restrict that to specific areas. So we adjust the slope range, and now we have a very sharp cutoff. And we do want it to be kind of sharp, but we want to blend that in a little bit more. So now what we can use is the fuzziness options to the right of our slope range. And just by increasing those amounts a little bit, we can give a nice little blend. And it looks like we might need to increase that slope range a little bit more. And let's just take a look at a render of that. And that looks pretty good so far. We might want to bring down that slope range a little more to have it cover a little more of the branches. And also adjust that fuzziness, because we can see on the bottom of our trunk it's really blending maybe too much. So go back into our surface, adjust that slope range, and we can also see that of course we will need to do that for not our icicles but our snow material. So we'll bring that down a little bit more, and then I'm going to reduce our fuzziness down to 3% on steep and flat, and click OK. Now we have the trunk on the bottom really largely covered, but of course it is bending because we have that droop option on. So let's just let this finish, and then we can take a look at adding a little more bumpiness to the actual branches themselves and make it look even more realistic. And that looks pretty good from what I can see. We'll go ahead and zoom out a bit. And now what I want to do is to add a little more variation to actually add some depth of snow onto our branches. So instead of having just material based, what we can do is use an object to create some different types of snow blobs to add on as part of our ecosystem to really give it that realism that we need. And when we do that, we might be able to even decrease the snow material depending on how it looks. And another thing we might want to do is really, because we can't save this tree out in this manner because of the ecosystem, we wouldn't really be able to create another ecosystem of these trees because that we have the objects as an ecosystem. So you can't have an ecosystem within an ecosystem. But what we should do is our polygon amount for this tree is really kind of low. So what we can do is open up the plant editor, and I'm going to click ×2 within our window here to give us even more polygons and make the tree look even better. But what we'll need to do at this point now is to repopulate our icicles because our branches have moved slightly. And we can just adjust that slope range, repopulate, and now we're going to have a much higher detailed tree. And we'll just go ahead and render this out so we can take a look and really see the difference, because we want to cut down on that kind of polygon look that you have with the lower resolutions. And like I said, since we're really sticking with this tree, we're not going to be using the solid growth variations. We don't have to worry about losing that polygon quality with copies of this tree. And that looks really good so far. And just before we go ahead and create those snow objects, what I want to do is show you how we can make this snow only really show up on one side of the tree. So we'll go back into our material, and if we take a look at the snow layer, what we can end up using is just that preferred orientation again, and the tightness amount with the equal amount of fuzziness that we have for our slope range. We could also decrease our slope range and we'll go ahead and render that out. And now we're going to notice that we have just the snow appearing on the left side of our tree right now, but still showing up on the majority of the branches. So if we had the wind really coming in and hitting that side of the tree more, this is an option we could use to make that a little more realistic. Of course, we might want to increase that fuzziness option if we were going to use this effect. But I'm going to go back to just having a gentle snowfall type scene where we just have that snow more accumulating on the branches rather than kind of on the side in the trunk. So go back to that snow material, turn off preferred orientation, increase our slope range again, click OK. And we can see in the preview, although very small, it does look like that's about where we were at. Let's go ahead and just make sure we save this scene. And now we're going to create just some snow objects within the scene that we're going to save out and use as an addition to our ecosystem. And basically, we'll create these objects the same way we created our icicles. And you can use different variations of objects or the same object. It really depends on how much variation you want on your tree and how much realism and time you want to take working on your tree. So I'll just add in a sphere, and we're going to go ahead and squish this. We could also use another program like we did before, using Lightwave to model some of these objects. And it really depends on which resources you have available. I'm going to scale this down a little bit lower, so we're working at more of the scale we're going to end up with on the tree, now that we actually have a tree for reference. And this will help us modify our snow material to match what we're going to have on the tree, since we still want to be using that object mode and the mapping mode for that. So we'll scale that down just a little bit more. And now I'm going to just copy and paste a couple of these. Move this over. Squish this down to add a little more variation. And then copy and paste again. And now we don't want to make really long objects. We kind of want them to be circular blobs, because they will be overlapping, and we don't want any kind of longer areas of snow going over the branches where it'll look unrealistic. Make another copy and move that out. And now we just have this little blob here that we'll be able to apply as an ecosystem. And what we could also do is just take some of these spheres that we have I'm going to take our sphere number 3, just copy and paste, really squish that down and scale it up, and kind of fit that on the bottom of our object, and that way its shape should be a little flatter on the bottom, and it'll look just a little bit better. So there we go. Now we can take all of these spheres we created, and we want to create a meta blob. And now we can see that nice little bit of snow, or what will become snow. We can see that flat surface on the bottom, which is going to look a little more realistic. But we do want to modify kind of our envelope distance, so I'm going to double click on this object and decrease our envelope distance so that we have a little more variation. We can also decrease our intensity until we have a little more variation. Maybe add a few more smaller objects within this meta blob to vary it a little bit more. So we'll expand our meta blob, select one of our spheres, copy and paste, move it upward, and I'm going to scale this down a little bit. Move that onto the top, and make a couple of more, copy and paste, move that over to the side, copy and paste, stretch that out, maybe change our scale, and now we're going to take all of these spheres and move them into our meta blob. So now we have an object that we can use as kind of our snow object. Adjust our envelope distance until it looks a little better. And we also want to make sure these are going to blend together correctly. And we can see that with this slope we have on the side, we might want to edit that bottom sphere and just kind of scale that in. And then also add another sphere on the end over here, where we can copy and paste one of the ones we had from before. And then we're going to rotate this so it's elongated the other way, and the opposite of what we have. And that'll kind of flatten out that area. Go ahead and fit that in there. Copy and paste and put one on the other side, and now move these spheres into that meta blob. And that looks a little bit better. And because we're working with such a small object, it can sometimes be difficult to maneuver the camera around it. And what we can do to have a little more subtle change of that camera motion is to actually go into, select our camera, go into our ruler tab, and then we can modify its position with each of these settings, and that'll give us a much more subtle movement as we rotate around and kind of edit the object. So I think this looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and just save our scene really quick. Take our meta blob, double click, or actually we want to right mouse click and go to Bake to Polygons. And we can set our polygon amount. We can see this is a very low polygon object right now. We might not have the definition we need, so I can undo, bake a new object, a little bit of a higher polygon amount, and that looks pretty good. So now all we need to worry about is the surface we want to have on this object. So we're going to select our maple tree, and I'm going to copy that trunk with the icicles, go to our meta blob, and paste that material. Once we get in here, we want to change this name to Snow Blob, and then we're going to be removing a majority of these materials. I'm going to delete our layer of our bark and also delete our ecosystem layer. So now we just have that snow. And this is set to world standard. And if we take a look at our maple tree, we want to see that we have the world standard mode set for that layer as well. So now we know that no matter what side these blobs are going to end up, the snow is going to look correct. I'm also going to rename this and call it Snow Blob. And now you can create different variations too, to have different types of blobs to use on your object in different shapes and sizes. But right now I'm just going to stick with this one, and we'll select the object, save this object, and we could just call this Snow Blob. And we want to incorporate texture maps, compress file if you're using outside textures. In this case we're not. Go ahead and save that out. And I'm going to keep that in our scene for right now, just in case the object we saved out, maybe something was wrong with it, and that way we don't remove it from the scene entirely. But we do not need to have it in view. And if you really want to make sure it doesn't render or the shadows don't show up, we can add another layer in the lower left here, drag our snow blob into that, and then turn off that layer so that our eye is closed. And now that's not going to be showing up in the scene. And really make sure we can right mouse click and go to hide from render. And now we'll select our rural maple tree. We're going to open up that bark material. And now I'm going to select just our snow layer and click ecosystem. And that's automatically going to add another ecosystem layer that we can use. We're going to add an object. We can select that snow blob we created. And now populate. And we can see that start to show up on our surface. We'll increase the density. And we might want to increase the scale of this object a little. We could also set up our variations. So if we want to have it a little non-uniform, we'll have more variations up and down. Increase our overall scaling to make them a little bit larger if needed. And we also want to make sure that we're not populating on that trunk. So with our layer, in our ecosystem layer, we're going to adjust that slope range and bring it up a little higher, even though we already had some of that carried over from before. And that looks pretty good so far. Our direction below surface we're going to set to proportional to the size of the instance and make it below the surface just a little so it's going into our branches. And we can remove some of those unsightly areas. And then our orientation, we can set this perpendicular to the surface so it'll conform a little bit better. And now we have the nice bends and dips where we need them, or we could set it to be vertical. But perpendicular is really going to work best for this. And that looks like it should be okay to start with. So let's go ahead and do a render of this tree and our scene right now to see how it looks. And now the main problem we can see is that a lot of them are really too large, and there's basically too many of them. Also, the way these are oriented and the way we saved it, they're not really conforming to the branches as well as they should be. So what I can do is rotate our object a little bit and resave it to try to get that to conform a little bit better. And also just make some more modifications to our density. We'll go ahead and decrease our density, reduce our scale, make it a little more uniform, because we really just want some smaller areas with this showing up. And I'm going to bring this below the surface a little bit more. And then for that orientation, we're going to go back to our snow blob and select that object. And what I want to do is, the main problem is it is still kind of elongated. So we could either scale this down and kind of squish it, or we could rotate it to face the other direction. We'll go ahead and turn that layer back on. Let's rotate that the other way. And now save our object as SnowBlob2. And we'll turn off that layer. Go back to our maple tree. Select that ecosystem layer, and I'm going to add in the SnowBlob2 object, set it to our same size, and then remove the first one, and we can repopulate. And that'll help with the way that those blobs were oriented on our branches. We'll go ahead and render out another frame, and we can take a look. Now we can see there's quite a few problems with this. Mainly, we're seeing a lot of shadows underneath our blobs, and this is causing a very bad blend between the two surfaces. So what I can do is either increase the ambient amount of lighting in the scene, or increase the ambient amount on the material of that snow blob. And that will help have a nice blend between these two surfaces, because really right now we have these dark areas and it just does not look realistic. Another thing I'm going to want to do is have an affinity with the icicle layer, and that way it'll create these blobs a little bit closer to the icicles themselves, and it'll look more realistic. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go to our atmosphere editor, select our light, and go much more to the ambient side, and that'll help decrease those shadows. And then if we go back into our material, now we have the icicles on our top layer. So we want to take this snow blob object and move this up above these icicles. And that way, what we can do is go to our affinity with layer and increase that amount, repopulate. And these blobs are going to start to show up by our icicles. And we might need to increase the scale a little. Go back and repopulate those icicles now that we moved the layer. And it looks like our scale is a little bit off. Increase the scale for that snow. And this should look a little bit better. We might want to bring them below the surface a little bit more. Maybe scale that down. But like I said, a lot of it could have to do with the material. So let's just go ahead and render this out and take a look. And see if this is something that's really going to work for this tree. Because sometimes it's not going to work directly for the type of tree you're working on. And modifications might need to be made because of that. And we can see it looks a little bit better, but of course we still need to modify some of those objects. So let's just go and edit that material really quick. Select our snow blob. I'm going to open it up. One thing I'm really going to do is decrease that bump amount, so we just have a very subtle bump. And then under effects, I'm going to increase that ambient amount and just decrease our diffusion. So it's really much more of an even blend and not as affected by the shadows. And then we can go ahead and just save that object. And we'll create a third version. And then we can use this to populate that snow. So we'll go back to that ecosystem layer with SnowBlob2, add in an object, select our third one, remove our second, match our scales, repopulate, and we can bring this up a little bit more now. Maybe decrease the affinity with layer just a little bit, and go ahead and render this out and just take a look and see how that's going to look. Because of course with some of the other dead trees we have more surface area, so we are able to achieve this effect a little bit better, and with this maple tree it might not look correct, and it might not look even. But another thing you could do is also create larger variations of these snow blobs and either manually place them on the tree depending on how large the tree is or how many trees you're going to have in the scene. But we can already see with this rendering that ambient amount that we edited is making it look a lot better. And now there are other things you can do where you can have transparency just on the bottom part of your object and have that blend in really well, but that's going to cause issues with these kind of builds up on these branches over here where we have this large sort of blob on this smaller branch. Of course, we can always edit these ecosystem instances and place them, and delete them, and modify them with our instance editor. And another thing we can do, which we can do with our icicles as well, is to paint this effect. If we switch to where we can see our top view and open up the ecosystem painter, now we can add in these objects. I'll select our snow blob 3, and we'll go ahead and just kind of select our object, maybe increase our scale a little, and now we can manually add in where we want these blobs to be on our object. We could also do the same thing with our icicles, and that way we can really be more specific about how we want this object to look. And in this case it might work better to just manually place these snow blobs, because the thickness of our branches will really determine where a lot of these instances show up, and if they do, and sometimes the icicles just won't populate on certain branches. So this is a way to really make sure that they're exactly where you want them to be. So we'll just go ahead and save this scene really quick. And since we already have this material created, let's go ahead and take a look at a different tree. And we can just apply this material that we have for the tree, because it's all material based now, and just take a look on other types of trees. And we have our large dead tree, which works pretty well. Go ahead and switch this to the move gizmo. We're going to move this off to the side. We'll make some modifications. We want a few more branches. We'll go ahead and increase the diameter of this tree. Droop this down a little more. And that looks pretty interesting. We can gnarl it and really do whatever you want with it. Increase the polygon amount if needed. Go ahead and hit ×2. Click OK. We'll go to our maple tree. Select that surface. Copy the material. And we're going to paste it on the bark. And now we want to rename this material and call this dead tree trunk, and that way we have a separate material that we can modify if needed, and there won't be any problems with conflicting material names. And we just need to go through and populate our icicles, and now we can see that we're having a huge change here with our scale. And if we go back to our maple tree and take a look at our icicle, we have a much lower scale. So what we can do is copy that amount, go back to our dead tree, just paste that over and repopulate, go to our snow and populate that as well. And now we have this large dead tree that we're using with the same surface material, to give us the same sort of an effect. So let's go ahead and just render this out, and we can take a look at both of these trees. And we can tell that both surfaces look really good on these trees. Of course, the blob snow that we had created looks a little bit better on this large dead tree because of the surface area we have on the branches. And we might want to modify the overall shape to maybe droop it down a little bit more. You get a very good idea of how this is going to turn out. Now, the big difference between using a tree with leaves and one that is created for the purpose of not having leaves is that if we take a look at the maple tree, we can see we have very round branches on the ends. If we take a look at the large dead tree, we see it comes to a very fine point and looks a little more realistic. And that's just definitely one thing to keep in mind while you're working on these types of trees. But let's go ahead and kind of make a little scene out of this, since we've spent so much time actually creating this and putting it all together. So we might as well make something a little more useful and blend them together and kind of complete that overall scene. So go ahead and close this out in our render window. And I'm going to save this for where we're at right now. And we just want to add in a terrain. And I'm going to go ahead and scale this up nice and large. We're going to move that down, just scaling on the Z with our gizmo. And I'm going to right mouse click and go to Edit Object to open our terrain editor. I'm going to click ×2 in order to increase our resolution of this terrain. And I want a little more bump on some of our areas. I can click Mountain again, and now it's going to give us more variation because we have a higher resolution. But overall, our snowbanks we're going to want very, very smooth, so we can use our Diffusive Erosion under the Erode tab, and just keep clicking that button until we have a very, very smooth surface. And because we don't really have a whole lot of detail, we don't need to go higher than 512 by 512. Depending on the size of the surface, we might need to hit ×2, 1024 by 1024, and then we'll want to diffuse it even more, and that'll give us a very nice looking surface. We could also use some of these other settings. We could add dunes. If we go ahead and add that, we can see that really makes a huge peak on here. So I want to undo, and we're just going to click OK and use this setting. Scale this down a little more. And what we can do is just copy these terrains around in our scene. And I'm just going to apply a snow material. And what we can do is use the snow material we're using for the blobs. Copy that material, select our terrain, paste it. We want to make sure we call this snow terrain to give it a separate name. And I'm going to decrease that ambient amount and increase our diffusion. And we might want to increase that bump map up a little bit higher now. And because of the way our scene is lit, we really can't see that snow. So we're going to need to make some modifications. But let's go ahead and scale that up on the Z a little more. And we can go to our top view and copy and paste some of these terrains to have more variation in the scene. Select our first terrain, maybe scale that up really large, and then shrink it down on our Z-axis just to have more coverage of the area. And take our copied terrain and kind of place that around the edges and anywhere where there isn't snow showing up. Scale that up. And then we want to take our two trees that we created. First we'll need to go to our painted ecosystem and just kind of clear that out. because now we're going to be moving these trees. And we want to make sure that they're on our terrain. And we'll need to modify our camera. And just kind of move around. And we could use the drop object command, but really I'm just going to kind of fit these in place. And then we could even copy and paste these trees over if we want some more of these icicle covered trees. But let's take a look at our lighting so that we can see the snow on the ground. I'm going to decrease our sky dome lighting gain. Maybe move a little more towards the sunlight. And I'm going to reposition our sun a little. And we might even need to modify the material for that snow so that we can see some of those bumps a little bit better. And really by adjusting the ambient amount, that'll take care of that. But mainly in the surface and not so much within our lighting. So we'll go back to our first terrain. We're going to take a look under effects. Just remove that diffusion down to 60 and decrease our ambient amount a little bit more. And take a look. And now we can see that snow a lot better in our scene. Go ahead and copy that material and just paste it to our other terrain that we had carried over. And we can modify our lighting however we want. Just kind of adjust it till we get to a point where we think it looks okay. We could add clouds to the scene, have more of a sunrise, something midday, and always compensating for our snow as we adjust these lighting values, because sometimes they will wash out our overall scene. And we'll reposition the camera. And now we can just see these two trees next to each other. Let's go ahead and just render out a frame of this and take a look. And what I really want to do is just remove those snow blobs from our trees, because with this lighting situation that we have, it really isn't looking very realistic. So we'll go into both of these objects, and just where these blob layers are, we'll just go ahead and remove those from each of our surfaces. And I'm going to go into the atmosphere editor, and under sky fog and haze, I'm going to go ahead and increase our haze amount and really wash out the sky a little more. We can increase the fog density. And then if we need to, we can also adjust that aerial perspective to make that glow a little more. And just the two settings with our glow effect will really give us the ability to kind of wash out the scene, make it look more like winter. And we could always add a cloud layer if we wanted to. We'll just add in our low clouds. And I'm going to increase the ambient lighting on those. Decrease our density. So they're just really light clouds in our scene. Increase the cover. And just give us a nice little blend into our scene. And then we could even adjust some of our lighting settings again to affect our clouds now that we have a little more variation. In some of our different haze amounts. We'll go ahead and just render this out and take a look at our scene. And overall, I think it looks pretty good. We might want to adjust the snow a little more on the bottom, do a little tweaking, maybe decrease the highlight amount so it's not so bright, or the ambient amount. But I think it's definitely something that's workable. We can create other trees in the scene to make it a little more dense, maybe add some different types of trees. And there's really a lot we can do with it. We could even add a spectral cloud layer that's on the ground to create a very dense looking fog, or even give the effect of snow falling. And another thing we could do to add more realism is to go into our terrain editor and select our terrains to raise up just the areas around where the trees meet and connect with our terrain to give us nice little snow drifts and add even more realism to the scene. But I think this pretty much covers how to create icicle covered trees and really make them look like they're part of winter, something that's realistic enough to be used for your different scene creation.